So that's great insight. In that metaphor, was 2020 the cosmic huge fire that burns everything forever, or was it the mini fire that prepares us? Because honestly, I wonder if we haven't had enough mini, moments of trial.
Yes.
That 2020 became this huge combustible, burn all of California down, which actually happened, honestly, in California. And so now we're coming out of this thinking, wow, this has just been like, this was the worst thing ever.
Hey guys, Dave here. Just wanted to give you a heads up that we ran into an issue throughout this video where at some points my video feed lags a little bit behind the audio. And so I wanted to apologize for the distraction and let you know that in the next episode, we're going to be unveiling a brand new setup that will hopefully look and sound much better. So thank you for your patience, and without further ado, hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the Allison Park Leadership Podcast, where we uncover the principles behind the plans. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Dave.
And my name is Jeff. And this is Allison Park Leadership Podcast. And so I'm the lead pastor at Allison Park Church, have been for almost 30 years now. And Dave is the campus pastor at our Northside campus. So we're one church in 6 physical locations and an online campus now. And Dave is also my son. Okay, so for a long, long time, Dave has always been the child of the 5 that I have that asks me the tough questions. So what do you think about this? Or why do you think we should do this? So we actually thought it would be a great thing for us to be able to dialogue about important matters that affect ministry and life in the church, and to get into some of the things behind the why, behind the what. So that's what this is all about.
Yeah, the principles, right? Because there's so much out there on the plan, on planning for your future, planning for your success, planning on the rebuild of your ministry or whatever it might be. There's a lot on strategy out there. But what I've found is I haven't found as much on the principles behind the plans. And there's a lot inside you, Jeff, that you've already kind of thought through, even if it's only on an instinctual level. And so what's been fun is doing this podcast where we can kind of uncover some of those principles and hopefully share some things with our listeners and viewers that might help enrich your life.
Yeah.
So today, the principle we're going to be focusing on is really an alternative, healthier, hopefully, perspective on how to look at what's taken place over the last year. There's so much that we can take away that just seems to be doom and gloom. But we were having a conversation, Jeff, the other day when we were talking about this process that we're in of trying to rebuild our world, and specifically the church world that we're a part of, the Allison Park Church Network. And so I was asking the questions, I was just saying, I'm ready for things to go back to normal. When do you think we can finally rebuild? And you said to me something that I found to be profound. You said, well, I think that might not be the right question. We really don't know when we can rebuild. But now that we're in this process, it's an opportunity for us to look at what we're going to rebuild. Or maybe a better question you said would be, who are we becoming? And so the way that I'm thinking of this anyway is that the main idea from today is sometimes things need to be destroyed to make way for something better to grow. So we're going to talk about that in light of the pandemic and everything that's happened over the last 10 months. So yeah, why don't you start off? Do you have any initial thoughts about this?
Yeah. So, the big question that has been, there have been podcasts about, and there have been seminars about, and online events and blog posts is how to reopen, when to reopen, what are the strategies for reopen? And actually, when the pandemic began, we thought reopen meant 2 months. And then it went on and went on and went on. Now here we are, 10 plus months into the COVID-19 pandemic. And people are still saying, so now what? I have conversations with pastors now. The vaccine is starting to be distributed. So when do you think we'll reopen? That's a big question. And when we do, how many people are going to come back? And what will you do different? And what will you do to reopen? All very good questions. Probably there are many, many people that are going to give you a podcast or a teaching with better insights about when and how than we can. Right? So What we want to talk about is not when and how, but we want to talk about really who. So, after all this stuff that we've gone through, who do you want to be in the future when you reopen? Because I think that is a question maybe I've been asking myself more as a result of everything. Like, man, I didn't know we were this, and I didn't know people were this, and I didn't know all of this was out there or beneath the surface. So now I'm really concerned. I think less about the numerics, about the goals, and I'm a little bit more concerned about the content of who we are
Yeah.
uh, than I was before. And I think that's a really good change.
That is really good. Our conversation sparked a lot of analogies, pictures in my mind when we were talking. Like you think of the classic, the phoenix that dies and then gets born again from the ashes, or a butterfly in a cocoon. I was looking into this kind of stuff, and I found a really interesting article on forest fires, which I know doesn't sound interesting, but it is in this context. It's from an article from, I guess, an educator at the University of Michigan State. The article, in case you want to look it up, it's called "The Role of Fire: The Role of Fire in Forest Ecosystems." So I'm just going to read a little snippet from this because I think it's actually interesting when we think about forest fires in terms of what's happened over the last year in our world. So it says most people learn early on in life that fire is a bad thing, having been warned of its dangers by their parents, or perhaps learning the lesson firsthand from sitting a little too close to a campfire. For a long time in our country, forest managers also had a similar belief that forest fires were always detrimental to the ecosystems they were managing and needed to be extinguished as soon as possible. And I'm kind of skimming through. However, as forest managers and ecologists learned more about the role of fire, management strategies began to change. After the Yellowstone fires in 1988, which burned over 1,200 square miles, the benefits of allowing forest fires to burn were starting to be understood. It goes on to say fire is a natural part of our forest ecosystems occurring in regular intervals that vary depending on the forest type, forest understory, climate, soil type factors, etc. Natural forest fires are typically started by lightning during warm and dry seasons, which range from the snow melt period in the spring through the fall. Historically, since these lightning-caused fires occur at regular intervals, they were successful, here's what's interesting, in clearing out old, dead, and or decaying vegetation bit by bit. Old vegetation was continually being recycled into new growth. And then I found this interesting too. When these types of fires are suppressed, the result is a buildup of fuel. Over the period of years, more and more fuel accumulates, setting the stage for a catastrophic event such as what occurred in Yellowstone in 1988. The Peshtigo fire was largely a result of excessive accumulation of fuel, mainly through logging / left from extensive logging that took place. So essentially, I'm going to just summarize the rest of it. They talk about the role of fire. Sometimes they'll even set fires on purpose because it doesn't burn down all the healthy stuff. What it does is it burns down the excess dead wood and what can be fuel, so that rather than having this massive emergency where everything burns down, it clears out a path for new growth and for a healthy forest. What people used to think of as being the scary bad thing, the fire, is actually a natural process that prepares the world, the forest, for more growth. And I think, to me, that sort of speaks maybe to an opportunity that we might have in our world as we kind of hopefully are coming towards the end of this pandemic, the end of the fire. Lots has burnt down, but now we have an opportunity for new growth.
So that's great insight. In that metaphor, was 2020 the cosmic huge fire that burns everything forever, or was it the mini fire that prepares us? Because honestly, I wonder if we haven't had enough mini, uh, moments of trial
Yes.
that 2020 became this huge combustible, burn all of California down, kind of, which actually happened, honestly, in California. And so now we're coming out of this thinking, wow, this has just been like, this was the worst thing ever. What would you say? Was it a mini fire, or was it the massive fire because we haven't had enough purifying work to go on previous?
Well, that is a great segue into my question because I had some questions for you. And if you're listening, Jeff doesn't know my questions. Usually I just kind of write these so I get fresh answers. So what I want to talk about, I'm going to just give you an overview of my questions that we can kind of hit them one by one. The first question is, what do you think has been burnt down specifically? And we'll talk about a range of that because I think that there's been a lot of things that have been burned down. Um, and then I want to talk about, do you think there have been good things permanently lost? Do you think that there has been bad, old, dead stuff that was burnt? All right, so we'll start there. Then I want to go, so just giving you, preparing you, Jeff. Then I want to talk about the opportunities we have to build and then how we can prepare for all of this. But here's my first question for you. Okay, what do you think has burnt down specifically, good and bad? And then I guess as a follow up, is there anything that you think we've permanently lost or are at risk maybe of permanently losing that is a good thing?
Oof, wow. What has burned down? Okay. I think one of the things that is at least singed on the edges is the CEO model of pastor, right? So for a long time, it tends to be, especially seems to be in American history, that whatever the predominant model is in the American culture becomes the predominant model in the American church. For a little while, it was the TV star pastor, right? Now it is the CEO pastor. You have build this mega church organization and with studying management and leadership principles. And then all of a sudden, when we all went online and we all started to go through all this tension, you realize, I don't know if I want my pastor to be a CEO. I think I want him to be a man or woman of God. I think I want them to be a person who burns bright and gives me someone that I can look to that both makes me feel safe and cared for, as well as challenged appropriately. So I think that's one thing that probably has changed. I think I don't know if this burned down or just been exposed. I think the segregation of the church racially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Uh, I wish the wall was burned down. I think maybe the illusion that we're all reconciled has burned to the ground.
Yeah.
And the reality is that, boy, the church has some work to do. I mean, the fact that we are this segregated in our culture, locations, communication, understanding. So the illusion of reconciliation has burned to the ground. That's another thing I think that's true. Boy, there's been so much. This is probably an episode in and of itself about so we're Pentecostal charismatic, right? In our framework, and we believe in the fivefold ministry gifts. And we believe in the function of the prophetic. But the way that some of the prophetic voices function during the election season, especially, boy, that's definitely singed on the edges there. If not burned and needing to be rebuilt, some of the things that have gone on with that. I think some people's religious life burned to the ground because they only had a religious habit. They didn't really have a relationship with God. And they maybe rebuilt that during the pandemic, or maybe not. Maybe they're still recovering. So I think that's kind of a piece of the puzzle. What things do you see that burned?
I think you did a really good job of kind of hitting a lot of the things that I was thinking. I think that what I don't know if this is okay. I think this is burning. Let me just say that. I don't know. I think there's a lot that's still on fire, quite honestly. I think this is still burning and has yet to see how we're going to split here. It almost feels to me like we're at a crossroads. But one thing that I think was exposed and is burning was a lot of superficiality in churches. I read this article, didn't fully agree with it, but it was after one of the major pastors on the scene in our current culture in social media, et cetera, had a moral failure. And somebody wrote an article, that was saying, make pastors uncool again, and somebody was talking about how so often it seems like pastors are trying to say, like, I'm like you, but as a non-Christian, I would prefer that they make me want to be like them instead of vice versa. So I think that there's been a little bit of superficiality that's been burned. I think what we maybe got into a little bit of a rut of trying whatever method we could possibly think of to, make the church I think people always try to mistype it as saying cool. I don't ever think it was supposed to be cool. I think we were trying to show it's normal. This is something that you can still be a normal human and not be a weird, a weirdo who dresses weird and only listens to, if you like Bill Gaither, great, but only listens to Bill Gaither, you know what I mean? Um, or whatever else. And so I think that maybe some superficiality that snuck in under the guise of evangelism is burning. There's probably a host of other things. So let me ask you this first question. Can you see anything that we've permanently lost or are at risk of permanently losing that might have been good? My initial thought is there's probably nothing that we couldn't save that's worth saving. I don't think it was a catastrophic California fire where we have been at risk of losing something major. I think probably the only way we can lose something that valuable is when we give it up ourselves, in my opinion. But have you seen anything that you think is at risk of being lost? I know people lost their sanity for a little bit, a little while, but yeah, what are your thoughts?
So the only thing I would say there is I'm concerned that the church has lost some credibility through this. That because of the ways that so many people acted during the election season, that people have associated um, with the church. They've associated a lot of angry, toxic behaviors. So
Yeah,
when there was the riots at the Capitol building, and there was people climbing the walls of the Capitol, and then there was this flag that says Jesus for Trump, and here you have the name Jesus right in the center of this riot. And I know that a lot of people have looked at that and wanted to say, what does Jesus have to do with any of that? And so some people have, maybe that's been like the last straw for them, where they've sort of said, I'm giving up on Christianity. I don't want anything to do with those people. That's not lost forever. I think we're already in a hole in American culture of trying to be credible for people who maybe had been burned by religion or by the church or just had become jaded because of their worldview. And so I don't think that's gone forever, but I think that is going to require intensive work to reestablish.
yeah.
That
You
would be
actually go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, that would be probably the one thing I'd point out.
You actually said something that I found really interesting the other day. You were saying now that the term evangelical Christian is largely associated by people who aren't following Christ to be a crazy nut with a shotgun who wants to hunt someone down who's not a Republican. I mean, I know that that's a meme. I know that that's probably an exaggeration, but there is a sort of a unavoidable connection or link or association is the word I'm looking for between evangelical Christian and political conservative activist, political specifically being the operative word there. That's probably something we've lost.
Yeah, I don't know.
Being able to.
I don't know how to define myself anymore. I know that sounds like a crazy thing. Like, so I call myself Pentecostal because I believe in the power of God, the supernatural, and the Holy Spirit's work. I would have considered myself an evangelical theologically. I don't know that I fit into that category like you just described politically. But I don't know that I fit into the category of not that either. Like, I don't fit into any box easily. So, we're a part of a movement called the Assemblies of God. That's my heritage. But if I were going to actually talk to somebody who was not a believer and they were going to ask me, what are you? And sometimes I even wonder myself, like, what am I? I know what I am. I just don't know what label to put on it anymore because, uh, you know, a lot of my friends who are pastors who are black pastors, let's say, they wouldn't necessarily use the term evangelical for them, but we're theologically aligned, right?
Mhm.
So because of the same kinds of things, and so, yeah, that's one of the things. I think I need to know who my tribe is again, because so much of what I have seen and heard, I've sort of felt like I don't think I belong there, and I don't think I
Yeah.
belong there, and I'm looking for where do I belong, and so I think one of the things I want to do because of my age and the length in ministry is I want to be that place for other pastors who are looking for a place to belong. I want to be that for you. And I want to figure out what that label sounds like so that we can describe ourselves properly to a world that's looking for us to regain credibility by the attitudes of humility and the desire to be people of love and grace and mercy and all the rest of that stuff. So yeah, that's one of those things that I'm wondering myself.
It's kind of crazy how quickly a word or a label or really I guess a reputation can be damaged.
Yeah.
And all it takes is one nut job who associates with a label that probably isn't that label to hurt the whole thing, you
Yeah.
know? So part of me is thinking like, well, it'll be nice to be able to call ourselves something that we agree with until someone else jumps in who doesn't reflect the values and does something weird again. And then it's like, well, I guess that's kind of a perpetual battle right now.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
this is way before your time, so before you were even born, Dave. But your mom's parents and your grandparents on that side of the family, Melody's, were ministering in Panama before you were born, and your great grandparents, the Spencers, Louis and Evelyn, had shifted in their focus, and they were now running Jimmy Swaggart's office in Panama. And Jimmy Swaggart went down there and had a big outdoor meeting, and they had billboards everywhere. It happened to be the very week that he was exposed as visiting a prostitute. So you have this major, massive public scandal with this evangelist. And the day it's hitting the news, there are Jimmy Swaggart billboards all over Panama that that were put up by your family, our family, right? And now they're trying to figure out what do we do? We've now associated ourselves, and this guy has fallen, and it's a public worldwide scandal. What do we do? And it took a while for those of us who were a part of Jimmy Swaggart's tribe, the Assemblies of God, and those who are Pentecostal charismatics, to sort of outlive that scandal, along with many others that were happening in the 80s. Obviously, it did huge damage to credibility. I think the Capitol riots had a similar effect,
yeah.
and so we have to realize we're living in the shadow of that, and it's our job to find a way forward.
Yeah, in fact, I think what you're talking about with Jimmy Swagger, I mean, that did so much damage to the term evangelist. You still really can't call yourself an evangelist. I mean, you can, but if you do, okay, so like someone I listen to, and his content's not always the cleanest, but the Joe Rogan podcast, Joe Rogan Experience, where I mean, he frequently when he's talking about cults, and he's not a Christian, he's talking about cults. He'll throw evangelist in there because he's thinking of people who ask for money and say crazy things on television. That probably stems from what happened in the 80s, what that you're talking about, where there were these massive scandals. And, I think it was Jimmy Baker who had the money scandal, right? The
Well,
financial thing.
yeah, it was money. It was also a sex scandal, and yeah, then there were many others who were online, and the way that certain fundraising happens sometimes on TV can be a little creepy, and so it's the carryover of that. If you put the word TV evangelist in front of evangelist, it's even worse than
Yes.
just the term evangelist. So, and I know that that's unfair to a lot of wonderful people who are broadcasting on television or are effective evangelists, but that is a label you have to overcome. And now
Mhm.
evangelical Christian is a label you have to overcome. And so a lot of us then search for, well, what term will I use so that I don't categorize myself in just introducing myself to people who don't even know me. Like I was on a plane, okay, coming back from Denver about 15 years ago, and I was sitting next to a guy. I asked him what he did for a living. He told me he was a doctor. He asked me, I said, pastor. He said, oh, I hate you people. And I was like, what? And I was like, you don't even know me. What do you mean you hate me? And so then he went off to say, oh, all you right wing, this and other things. And I said, well, how do you know my politics? I mean, you just met me. But there is a stereotype that people have when they see a label. And so that's one of the things that, and I think especially now, people are just flame throwing insults all the time. So it's gotten even more toxic in our culture overall.
Yeah, so there's been some things that we maybe lost. And some of what you said is probably a mix. There's some good things that we might have lost, some privileges, some peace of mind kind of things. Some of that probably is good that it burned. And there's probably more that is burnt down, that was fuel, that was old dead wood, that maybe we needed a forest fire a little bit earlier to clear out some of this. What have you seen that is a good result that's burnt? And you can talk culturally and you can talk in our nation and our world, but then I also want you to maybe take an APC angle because it's a little more personalized. So yeah, what do you think is burnt down that maybe needed to be burnt down?
Well, I think the illusion of reconciliation is been burned down, and what I see right now is I do see, although this is not something you see headlining all the time, there are a lot of pastors who are, whether they're Hispanic or black or white or whoever they are, who are working at relationships now. That's
Yeah.
happening. I think that's a very good thing. I think we have learned that we need our own personal devotional life. And I see in Allison Park Church, there is a hunger to now stay spiritually vibrant, regardless of what's happening with physical events and services. And so some people have dropped off the map and they're like, I'm not coming back to spiritual things until this is over. But a lot of people have figured out how to feed themselves during this time. And they
Yeah.
are purposefully immersing themselves in whatever they can, look at online or do for their own spiritual life that is really healthy. I think that's a good thing. Um, I think what's really good is a lot of times now we're thinking about how do we creatively reach people? I think maybe we gotten into a rut of saying we got to hold a big event to get as many people in a building as possible, and that's how we'll win the world for Christ. And now we've realized, boy, being online is effective. You can reach people online you couldn't reach in your building. And maybe
Yeah.
there are other creative ways we haven't tried before. And so I think the learning how to do evangelism effectively is one of those things that I think we're relearning. For Allison Park Church, I mean, I think what we learned is that our team is highly flexible and more gifted than we knew and really creative. And a lot of our team have really showed their true colors and they've just been shining. And it's made me recognize I need to give room for my team to be what they are, like to come up with innovative, creative ideas, to not stay stuck in patterns from the past. I think that's a really good thing. I discovered that my church is unbelievably generous because they kept on giving during this time, not just tithing, but giving to kingdom builders and other projects. That's really great. We discovered that we could serve our community better. So we started 2 new food banks in the past year. We have 6 campuses. We had 1 food bank at 1 location. Now we have 3, and we're ministering to over 500 families every week. That's amazing. I mean, that kind of stuff is really good. There's been a lot of good things birthed out of this because what innovation is when you don't have enough resources to meet your vision. That's a Mark Batterson definition. And so when you are lacking the resources to accomplish the vision, you have to get innovative. So a lot of really great innovations have happened. And I don't think we'll even know the full impact of that until years from now. We'll look back and say, when that started, that was during COVID-19. And I
Yeah,
think
sure.
a lot of churches are innovating, which is really some churches that hadn't innovated anything in
Mhm.
decades
Yeah.
have had to innovate. And so the old were stuck in a rut routine. For every church in America that burned, at least for a
Yeah.
couple of weeks. And
Yeah.
it forced innovation into the system, even for the oldest, most traditional non-change organization. That has
Yeah.
to be good, right? I would think that has to be good.
Yeah. You just described a ton of things that were like our mode of thinking or of coasting or presuppositions that we maybe needed to challenge, but didn't feel the need to challenge because there was not a driving impetus. When this happened and we had no other alternative, it forced us to take a look at everything deeply. Okay, we got to restart. We got to look at all this deeply, and then
Yeah,
see what we were possibly missing. I think a quote that kind of comes to mind. It's almost cliche, but the whole necessity is the mother of invention.
right.
Um, that's kind of where we were. So yeah, a lot of presuppositions, base methods of understanding how the world works and pastors work and the giftings of our staff and the roles people should fit. And I mean, even since all this has happened, we've totally redefined how campus pastors are supposed to work.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if that's entirely because of COVID-19, but it might have been birthed out of the fact that we've had to think so differently that we're now in this mindset kind of constantly. But what about this? What about this? You know, so I definitely think you're spot on with that. Okay, so let's try. We've talked a lot about what's burnt, but now we have the opportunity to rebuild, not just to rebuild, and not just to set a date for this is when we're hoping to reopen, and this is how we're gonna gain our momentum back and get our giving back up to par and get bodies and butts in the seats or whatever. Now we have an opportunity to instead say, what are the principles behind our blueprint? We're looking at rebuilding, and we want to become something better, right? So when you're looking at this, what do you think we have the opportunity to build or to become? We can start with APC, and then I want you to talk maybe more national, globally, sort of a thing. But what opportunities do we have? And you've spoken on a lot of them, racial reconciliation, etc. But what can we build into to become to allow for new growth?
Yeah. So, early on in the pandemic, when we would normally be doing our strategic planning, which almost always was focused on how big, how many, right? How big do we want this to be? How many do we want to have? What are the events we're going to plan? And so it was all outcome based. We spent that time talking about who do we want to be, and we invested some time and got some help and some coaching on what are our values as an organization. So who do we want to be long term? Who are we? Who do we want to be? And how do we embed that into ourselves? And so we identified three key values. We want to be people of humility, multiplication, and bold faith. And we have definitions for all those things. And we talked about how on a regular basis that needs to be who we are. That became clearer to us. For me, I would say one of the things that became really clear through the political season is that I don't want to be Republican and I don't want to be Democrat. I want to be about the kingdom of God. And so for me, the primacy of Jesus and his kingdom as my North Star, as what I'm aiming for, as what we all should be about, first and foremost, has become the driving call of my life. Like, I want to get back to the core of what it is to be a Christian. And then I want to live the kingdom, and I want to preach Jesus and his resurrection, and I want to be red hot on fire. And you know what? I don't really care if my numbers of attendance are lower than they used to be, or if I plant less campuses or churches, as long as I'm being true to, like, okay, less the CEO pastor, more the John the Baptist in the wilderness prophet guy, right? Like, I want to be calling people to repentance and living a life that's just blazing hot, so that when people get around me, they say, boy, that guy loves Jesus, or boy, that guy believes in the power of the Holy Spirit, or that guy's living for the kingdom of God. Like, at the end of the day, I really don't care about the size as much as I do the content of what we're becoming. And so, yeah, I think I've just shifted away from results and onto values, and I think that's a big thing for who we are, at least as Allison Park Church.
And something else that you've done that you didn't even necessarily mention there that I think has been amazing is you've been addressing touchy subjects with regularity.
Yeah.
In fact, one of my friends, Brandon, sent me a really funny text, when he was talking about, the message he was watching. He said something like, I'm reading from it now. He said, where do I want to read from? He was saying, that really polarizing topic that's been tied into a pretzel because there are so many different opinions and fake stories and ways to look at it. Let me jump into it head first, show you how the Bible and God wants you to react, how to treat others. He was talking about how in his experience before, he hasn't had a lot of churches or pastors that were willing to dive head in. I think that's something that I've seen you really leaning into. Maybe that's what you were talking about with the values and the principles, but you haven't really shied away from these things. I love that.
Yeah. So, yeah, preaching to the mess is a part of the thing that's happened. I think for me, if I were to take the journey, for the longest time, I felt like the best thing to do to keep everybody unified was to avoid the touchy subjects and just live a life of godly character and love and grace and be in a healthy church. And then when the pandemic started, then the mess was all around us, but I was still trying to stay politically correct, right? I don't want to upset people on either side, and so I'm going to do my best to just dance through this without getting too much in the middle of it. And then as it continued on, I became more comfortable with who I am, what I believe, what needed to be said. And I just became comfortable with the fact that no matter what, people were going to be fighting with each other. So I might as well just dive in there and take it head on. And I've gotten comfortable there. And I have gotten great response, like you're saying, from especially younger people who are like, boy, we need that, right? Not to come at it from a political angle, but if you can somehow manage to come at it from a Jesus perspective with passion, I think that's actually what people aren't just interested in the superficial sermon anymore either, right? We talked about superficiality burned to the ground. Maybe the superficial sermon died with it. Yeah. And it has to now be a message that has biblical content that is also culturally relevant and a bit going to hit you, right? You can't just go like, "Ooh, wonderful," like float over your head. It has to go.
The breakthrough's on the way. Yeah. Oh, yeah. A lot of criticisms I was hearing recently about messages from people that were tending to struggle with their faith who'd grown up was, this could have been in a TED Talk. This message could be a TED Talk to a room full of, atheist, agnostic, Muslim, like whatever other religion, and it wouldn't offend anybody because it's not really religious. And if that's what our messages were becoming, then I'm glad we had the chance to reset. And by the way, that's not a criticism of you specifically. I think that's just, the sentiment that people were having about the church in general, is that we were sort of headed that direction. But that's one good thing we've been able to come back to. We're getting close to the end. Couple questions I want to ask you. What do you think we have the opportunity to build or to become in America, or in our world, or this next generation? That's the first question. And then I'm going to have you close by the end giving, what do you think we can do to prepare as pastors and leaders? But yeah, so what do you think we have the opportunity now to build or to become in our nation with this current generation as we move forward?
Yeah, I think we have a chance to become known as a people who are for something, not against something. Too often, I think what we've been is a people who are against something. And because we're in a culture war and the culture in our country has changed so much, there has been a part of us that has felt like the need to stand against the tide of whatever it is that we don't like that's happening. And I think that's been exposed as the wrong way. I think what we now need to be known is what we're for. And I am willing to be persecuted because I preach a risen Jesus. I'm willing to be persecuted because I believe in the authority of the Bible, but not in a judgmental, harsh way, in a loving, tender, but yet firm and unflinching way. So I want to be for people who are broken and for people who are different from me. I want to be for the gospel. Paul said, I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus and him crucified. And I want people to know I have narrowed my focus down. It's about Jesus and him crucified, him raised from the dead in the power of the Holy Spirit. And this is what the church is. Forget all the other stuff that you know the church for. I want us to be narrow about the kingdom, about Jesus, and I want us to be known as what we're for. So I think we have an opportunity to coalesce around that because we're all trying to figure out what tribe we belong to, and that should be sort of the driving force for us. I also think now is the opportunity for the church to take the innovations that we've all discovered and to run with them as it opens up to see how far can we take this? What really new things can we develop? And I think coming out of this, there's going to be a great opportunity to multiply. There's going to be new campuses, new churches, new leaders birthed, and an opportunity. And I'll now prophesy a little bit what I think. I think this generation that went through this crazy time, especially the 13, 14, 15, 18-year-olds, have the opportunity to lead the church forward into a more radical form of Christianity than what we have known in past generations. And
Yeah.
I think that the young people have been awakened. And I think one of the biggest opportunities for us as church leaders is to not just think about us and our age in the next 3 years, but to really focus on those younger men and women who are emerging into themselves, and to equip them to lead so that they can be ferocious, on fire followers of Christ. Because I really think the next generation is going to be something special because of what
Yeah.
they've been through.
That's good. Okay. Final question in closing. What do pastors and leaders do to prepare for all of this? Now that we're rebuilding and we're not just focusing on when can we rebuild, but what are we rebuilding, or who are we going to become? How do we prepare for that as we hopefully head towards the light at the end of the tunnel?
So while you can't do everything you want to do externally, use this time to decide who you are. So think through, who do I want to be? What are my values? What's my center? What's my tribe? And coming out of this, what are my non-compromising values that will become the bottom line? Are you a CEO pastor? Are you a celebrity pastor? Are you a red hot on fire John the Baptist type? I mean, what are you now? What will your preaching look like, right? So what's the content of what you want to be? Use the time of delay, because we're not fully open yet. We're sort of half. Use the time of delay to decide who you are and who you want to be, so that whenever things get busy again and we're all now able to do everything we could do before, you won't lose yourself again in the midst and then have to have another fire come to burn it all down, right? Make sure that what you're building won't burn. That might be, to use your metaphor, make sure it will it would last regardless of the circumstances.
Yeah. And I think on a practical level, the way that this often happens is conversations just like the one we're having. So it might be a conversation with your spouse. How do you think we're doing? Who do you think we're known as? And what are our values? And how do we want to shift those? It might be with the staff. It's often hard to see these things in isolation. And so if you're wondering, well, how do we align? I think it's conversations just like what we're having. In fact, a good springboard platform to spark this might actually be to share this podcast with those who you're wanting to have this conversation with, because that's the whole purpose of this. It's talking about the principles behind the plan. So before you make your plans for what you're going to build into, take a look at the principles, make a good blueprint, and then move forward. As we close the day, I just would love to ask for this again. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe or share this. We'd love it if you would leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps it to get recognized and known. Share this on your social media, because again, we want to be able to benefit those who are also trying to figure out what to do, how to plan for the future. So hopefully this will help to encourage and edify some people if we can share it together. As always, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, I got one more thought. Before we close. I had just this Holy Spirit moment, Dave, before we end.
Yeah.
So I was thinking of your metaphor of the fire. And I was thinking about how we've been through a fire in the past year. And you asked me what burned down. What were you surprised that burned down? And, this actually is what the Bible talks about, 1 Corinthians 3, that when we get to heaven, our works will go through a fire.
Yeah.
And you know how, like we said, I was a little surprised at this, and, this burned down. Boy, that didn't really have value. Just think of the weight of that moment. When you stand in eternity, that is not when you wanted to discover that what you spent your life building wouldn't last, right? So the question we're saying, who do I want to be, is so important, not just for how are we going to reopen when the pandemic's over. You're talking about your life. If you want your life to really count, when the next fire comes, nothing should burn, because you should be so well aligned with what has value, not just for this life, but for eternity. So maybe that's sort of like a little prophetic challenge. Don't just shut this podcast off and say, okay, that's over. I mean, really, really take some time to figure out who you're supposed to be in the eyes of God, because think that's really a critical thing. All right.
That's
Now,
so
now
good.
you can
Yeah.
finish. Sorry.
No, that's really good. Thank you for interjecting. I think we were discussing First Peter 1:6 and 7 kind of has the same type of thing where it
Yeah.
talks about trials, says these trials will show your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purify gold, though your faith is far more precious than gold. Okay, so then it talks about faith that remains strong through trials. I think that is a good metaphor.
Yeah.
This year, 2020, was a fire. We've come through it. Hopefully, some stuff is burned away so that ultimately, in the end, when we stand before God, our faith and our works are full of stuff that's not going to burn.
Yeah.
If it was before, it's a reset now. We can now have new growth under this new phase. Anyway, thanks again for joining us for this podcast. Subscribe and share it. We'll see you guys next time.